I find this very inspiring for how I want to go forward with this channel, for instance. I would love to do some videos in some hidden, beautiful, secret places and introduce them to you, my audience. What is good, everyone? Welcome to the channel. My name is Paul, and I make videos about Japanese society, life, and culture from the viewpoint of a long-term foreign resident. If you watch the channel, you know I'm usually outside filming and walking around. I'm not doing one of those topics. This is a midweek video where I'm going to be talking about book recommendations. So my interest in Japan runs pretty deep, and I've read a lot of books. And the books I'm going to share with you today are probably about 1/10 of my library on Japan. I'm just going to introduce to you what I think are really good reading for someone who wants to get deeper understanding of Japan. And I'm going to start off, as I am someone who has journeyed through Japan over the past 20 years. I'm going to share a couple of my favorite travelogues, or basically Westerners who are writing about their experience traveling through Japan. I absolutely could not do this video without introducing Donald Ritchie's The Inland Sea. This is such a striking account of his travels through the Inland Sea, the Seto Inland Sea, which is basically that area between Honshu and Shikoku, all of the hundreds of islands that are in that area. He traveled throughout that sea, and this is still pretty close to just the post-war period, and it's just a wonderful expose of the people he met and the places he saw, and it's just a really romantic capturing of the imagination of Japan at that time. And so I definitely recommend this. I even went so far as to buy a first edition copy because I love this book. A second travelogue book, which I think is not as well known as The Inland Sea, is this one, The Japanese Chronicles by Nicolas Bouvier. He's a Frenchman who traveled through Japan, wrote some really beautiful portraits of the people and places and events that he experienced while he was in Japan. So from the travelogue type of book, these are the two I would recommend. I also really enjoy reading about Japanese people, whether they're famous or they're just learning about them through their diaries and such. And one such book is Donald Keene's Travelers of 100 Ages. Donald Keene, very prolific writer about Japan, and did a lot of translation of Japanese people's diaries. And so you get very interesting slice of life knowledge about the Japanese and Japan through this book. Again, Donald Ritchie, his book Japanese Portraits is fascinating. I just love how he writes and how he seems to observe people and describe people in a way that makes them just feel like they're very alive in your imagination, even though you've never personally met them. So Japanese Portraits is another one that I recommend. These would be the two I would say for like diary writing or for portraits of Japanese people, although I would add a historical one. One of the history books that I read is Musui's story, and this is fascinating because it's basically the accounting of a very mediocre samurai from the Tokugawa period, and it's all about how he never has enough money and how he's trying to get money to pay for this thing that he has an obligation for, and his drinking problems, and it's really just down to earth and a really interesting picture or portrait of a samurai in a way that you never see. You know, in the dramas on TV, it's always like the stoic samurai and it's battle and honor and duty, etc. This is much more real, and actually someone took this book and turned it into a YouTube video that I ran across a couple of weeks ago actually, and that video got 1.6 million views about this samurai's life, and it was basically just that YouTuber was taking all the information from this book, and I was thinking, why didn't I think of that? Okay, staying on the historical book kick, I would also recommend The Deer Gride Pavilion, which is a book by Pat Barr, and it's basically the accounts of Westerners who came to Japan after Japan opened to the West and the beginning of the Meiji era. And so this is about people who have come to Japan from Europe and from America and from all over, and it's their stories of what they encountered when they arrived. And again, it's a great way to get an idea of what life was like for Westerners at least, and of course you get an idea for Japanese as well during that Meiji era from the 1860s to the 1890s or so. Now, if you want to get more into understanding Japan as you travel And as you go around Japan, I want to share with you probably my favorite book that I've read in recent memory. I just finished it maybe a month ago or so, and that is this book by John Dougal, Kyoto. And it's just all about the different eras of that city, but most importantly for me is he constantly mentions places in Kyoto that tie to these historical events and people. And basically, when I read a book like this becomes my list of things that I'm going to see the next time I go to Kyoto, because there are a number of things that just sound absolutely beautiful, fascinating, historical places, places where people lived or that were built by famous people, or have to do with the tea ceremony or the Buddhist monasteries, etc. Definitely, this is going to make my next trip to Kyoto even better, because I basically created a whole list of I'm going here and here and here, and I've got to see that all just from having read this book. And Kyoto can feel very overwhelming if you don't know much about it. You can travel around that city and get kind of tired of the temples and shrines and all of the pretty houses, and the problem often is you just don't really know what you're looking at and what the historical context is. And so this is a great book as a primer or to take with you. This is highly recommended if you want to learn more about Kyoto and maybe plan your next trip to Kyoto around these places that are mentioned in here. Now, what led me to this book is actually a different book about Kyoto by Alex Kerr, which is Another Kyoto, and he mentions this book in here, and this goes even deeper. And basically this is Alex Kerr going into really interesting detail. If you're a total Japan nerd like me, reading about how things were built and how things were thought about and realized in the real world from the imaginations of architects and artists, and the development of art as it came from China through Korea. And basically this is a really deeper dive into the culture of Kyoto and just the details that you would never ever notice if you just walked around and looked at the pretty buildings and didn't really know what you were looking at. This is another way to really understand more about Kyoto and more about Japanese culture and Japanese way of thinking. And I can't mention Alex Kerr without bringing up the book that started pretty much everything for me when it came to being interested in Japanese antiques, being interested in Japanese older culture. What took me deeper beyond the surface level of my life in Japan was reading this book and discovering that there was so much about Japan from its past that I thought was amazing, was fascinating. This book in many ways led to all these other books here, because this is what sparked my imagination. It's one of the first books I read upon moving to Japan, and this set a lot of balls in motion, such as my ukiyo-e collection, which I've talked about on the channel before. So that this book is highly recommended, and my copy is falling apart because I've read it more than once. Related to that, my interest in Japanese architecture, art, beauty, Lost Japan, Another Kyoto, also led me to naturally really liking this book, which is John Roderick's Minka, about how he restored or basically bought a giant old farmhouse, had it reconstructed in Kamakura, which is very close to where I live. It's right next to Yokohama, and basically it became his amazing Japanese home with all those beautiful Japanese aesthetics that if you are a Japan freak, you love these things. Like, I mean, here I'm sitting in my Japanese room in my house because I wasn't going to have a house in Japan that didn't have a washitsu or Japanese style room. And this is about his house and the restoration and how it became an antique gallery, and basically kind of a world-class antique gallery, which still exists today apparently by appointment only. Maybe I'll try to find this place sometime in the future, but just reading about the process and about the house and his life in the house is very, very interesting. So it kind of fits into the Lost Japan category, but also kind of portraits of people category, and that made this book really fascinating for me. So I definitely recommend Minka, My Farmhouse in Japan. This is the sunshine and rainbows. I do have to bring up some books that take a kind of a critical look at Japan. And the first book that really kind of changed my idea or perspectives about Japan is this one, Mikiso Hane's Peasants, Rebels, and Outcasts. I think I picked this up at a used bookstore, and I think it was actually used as a textbook in classes at my university where I went to graduate school. But this dispels a lot of the myths that you might have about Japan, where Japanese people are always really respectful of authority and are always hardworking and doing their thing and not trying to make waves, and how Japanese people, we have the samurai salaryman culture where you have loyalty to your company and you work hard and you sacrifice so much of your personal life. This shows that that tradition and those ideas are not actually how it was in Japan. If you go back to pre-Meiji or pre-modern Japan, you have lots of scoundrels, you have lots of peasant revolts. There were villages always revolting against taxes and policies that were put in place that they didn't like. So the idea of Japanese have always been a society of orderly people is kind of thrown out the window by this. And so I recommend, just so you understand Japan isn't always exactly the image that you might have in your head, this is a good book to dispel some of those myths. And of course, probably the most famous critical look at Japan is Alex Kerr's, the same author of these two books, someone who clearly loves Japan, and this book is written with that in mind. It's like a love letter to Japan. Here's what you're kind of messing up and could improve on. But this is a rough read. It's very much a slog through a lot of negativity, and if you don't want to feel negative about Japan in any way, you probably don't want to read this. But if you want to have kind of a dose of realism, well, this is a good book to read. It's quite dated. There's a lot of things in here that aren't really true or have changed, which is a great thing. But there are definitely things in here that you'll be able to see kind of, okay, Japan isn't all sunshine and rainbows and unicorns. And actually, upon reading this book, he keeps quoting the same author, Karl van Wolferen, who is a Dutch writer who wrote a much more scholarly take. And it's basically a lot of the information that Alex Kerr gets for this book. The book is called The Enigma of Japanese Power. This one is very dated because it's talking about politics and economics of the 80s and 90s. And obviously Japan is very, very far from those days in its modern form. But you do get some important insights into the Japanese ways of doing things, the Japanese ways of doing business, the ways the bureaucracy works in Japan or doesn't work in Japan. And because it's a scholarly work, it's pretty well researched and well backed up by facts. And so this is kind of the sensational version, and this is the more grounded academic version. And I think that's why Alex Kerr quotes this a lot, because it lends a lot of credibility to what he says here. But if you're not going for a serious academic read, or you don't really want to get into the negative things about Japan, the last book I'm going to recommend is another one that I've just finished recently, and that is Alex Kerr, Hidden Japan, which is just, it grabs your imagination. He's talking about these places that you've probably never heard of, and describes his travel there, what he sees, what he observes. And because he's so knowledgeable, he's picking up on things that I wouldn't pick up on if I visited these places. But again, if you are not in Japan and you just want your imagination captured with these beautiful portraits of places in Japan where not many tourists go, this is the book for you. Or if you live in Japan and you're looking for some kind of inspired journey that you might take, not necessarily to these exact places, but to find places similar to this, I find this very inspiring for how I want to go forward with this channel. For instance, I would love to do some videos in some hidden, beautiful, secret places. and introduce them to you, my audience. That's the sort of inspiration and imaginative beauty that I take from this book. And so if you just want to be transported to some very beautiful and intriguing places in Japan, Hidden Japan is a good book to go with. And that's where I'm going to finish today. Like I said, this is probably 1/10 of the books about Japan in my library, but I feel it's a good starting place if you are interested in these types of books on Japan, to get a deeper look into Japanese society, life, people, the culture, and places. Alright, just a quick midweek video. I hope you enjoyed it and got something useful out of it, even if it's just one book out of these that you think you might want to read. But I would actually recommend reading all of them. If you look for them and you read them, or you have read them, let us know in the comments, and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you so much for watching, and please be ready for my weekly video when it comes out on Friday night in the States, or Saturday morning if you're in Japan. My weekly video this week is going to be talking about gaijin bubbles. Alright, looking forward to seeing you there, and thanks for watching this one. Peace.